Hey, it's the Empire, Geoboxing Empire, Boxer Boxing. Nah, man, Chris Eubank Jr. fought Wakin Awdijan, crazy last name, I know. And wow, man, Chris Eubank Jr., man, he's been training with Roy Jones Jr., and he's been obviously implementing his Roy Jones Jr. technique within his own style. And this was basically a showing out fight to test his new technique with Roy Jones Jr. style infused with his own. Now, Chris Eubank Jr., man, this was a fifth round. The guy retired in his corner after the fifth round, and Roy Jones Jr. Chris Eubank Jr. was basically trying to hit. I was gonna call him Wankin. I was gonna call him by first name because last name is too hard. He was throwing leaping left hooks. He was trying to land leaping punches on this guy because he was fighting a southpaw. And this was a pretty good showing for Chris Eubank Jr., man. Now, Wakin, he had pretty good movement in the beginning. It made it really hard for Chris Eubank to close distance because he's fighting a southpaw, and he was catching Eubank with some shots early. But those are shots that Chris Eubank Jr., with his A1 chin, walked right through. And, as the fight went on and on, Chris Eubank Jr. was able to close the distance with a jab and basically start working this guy in his body. And like I said earlier, this Wakin guy had really good movement in the beginning, but as the rounds went on and Chris Eubank Jr. started working his body, he slowed down. Now, Chris Eubank Jr., I like the fact that he tried the Roy Jones Jr. type style in this Wakin fight, hit guys from a distance. That's Roy Jones Jr.'s bread and butter, but there's some things that Chris Eubank Jr. could have did better in this fight, in my opinion, like just throw a jab, or just keep the guy thinking about something, even if, because my Chris Eubank Jr. was trying to land power shots from the outside, but he wasn't really trying to engage with the guy outside of that. But you could tell Chris Eubank Jr., he was just toying with the guy. So obviously he didn't want to completely dominate the guy. This is more about working on new things in the ring that Roy Jones Jr. was teaching him. But at the end of the day, his old skills got things done with just him coming in the inside, working the body with his hooks. Chris Eubank Jr. is really good in the inside and really good at mid-range when he can hit you with hooks and uppercuts. But Chris Eubank Jr. problem is not fighting in the inside, it's boxing on the outside. Chris Eubank Jr. really needs to work on that. And he needs to use it because he has the tools, right? One of Chris Eubank Jr.'s biggest wins, in my opinion, are the win where he really showed he could box. It was a Nick Blackwell fight. And that was a fight where Chris Eubank Jr. beat the guy so bad, the guy, retired from the sport of boxing, and he was never the same after that. He had some serious injuries after the fight. Tried to come back again, and it was even worse. But Chris Eubank Jr. does have boxing skills, but he gets really anxious in the ring, and I think he just needs to work on throwing combinations on the outside with straight punches, no hooks, and knowing how to get past someone's jab who's not throwing it from a traditional stance. There's some fighters that give Chris Eubank Jr. problems, and those fighters can bend at the waist and throw jab from a really, really low angle, right? Think of the George Groves fight. George Groves was basically like crouching, throwing a jab, and then grabbing Chris Eubank Jr. when he tried to fight him on the inside, That being said, people who fight on the outside who give him problems as well, someone like a Billy Joe Saunders, fighting on the outside, those are Chris Eubank Jr.'s only 2 losses. So you really can't criticize the guy much. Understand that Chris Eubank Jr. has never been a champion. He's never had a legitimate title in boxing. So at least a world title. But Chris Eubank Jr., man, he's a really big deal, and I'm really glad that Roy Jones Jr. is training with him. He's training with him because he sees something in Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank Jr. has a lot of naysayers. Really, they're just haters of his dad, and Chris Eubank Jr. gets unfair treatment for sure. But now that Billy Joe Saunders took a loss and he got his eye socket broken by Canelo Alvarez, they're really in need of their new guy. And Chris Eubank Jr., now that he's not damaged goods, he can still fight. Now that he can still fight. So that being said, that's basically their best guy around 160, 168. Oh, 168, yeah. I think he's still one of the better fighters up there for sure, especially with Roy Jones Jr. training with him. If he can just get half of what Roy Jones Jr. has, he definitely has a bright future for sure. because there's a lot of fighters that are pretty good at 168, but Chris Eubank Jr. has a superior trainer and Roy Jones Jr. So we're gonna see how this whole thing works out. Hopefully Roy Jones Jr. is teaching him how that jab and to be consistent with it, and not just one jab. I'm talking about 3-4 jabs and jabs from different angles as well, using waist movement, boxing guys on the outside. I would like to see him throwing speed on the outside. But that being said, yeah, Chris Eubank Jr. is trying to catch his guy with like looping punches on the outside, because Chris Eubank Jr.'s guard was like a wide guard, right? Basically such that if this guy throws a straight left, for example, because he's southpaw, he can have momentum on that left hook. All right, if you watch Roy Jones Jr.'s training, or just his highlights period, Roy Jones Jr. has his hands at his waist, and when he throws that left hook, it's coming from a low angle. So Chris Eubank Jr., his style of punching, it's a little higher because his hands are higher, because that's how he throws his punches. And plus, he doesn't want to get hit as well, and he's fighting a southpaw. It's just a lot of things in this fight that Chris Eubank Jr. really couldn't do as well, because the guy is a southpaw, he's left-handed, so the angles are different, right? So we're gonna see what Chris Eubank Jr. does from here. But this was definitely a great fight from Chris Eubank Jr. It was a walk in the park for the guy, and wow, I'm really excited to see him in the ring. Roy Jones Jr. has been training with him. I've seen him in Miami. I've seen him in a country somewhere. I've been seeing him training. You guys see the videos of them everywhere. So this is a really big deal. I'm surprised that Chris Eubank Sr. Got Roy Jones Jr. to train a guy at all. But that's what happens when you have a lot of reach, and your father is Chris Eubank Sr. You could do things like that. But anyway, man, let me know how you guys feel about the fight. I thought it was an exciting fight. The guy stood no chance, and this is good. This is why I keep telling people, when you get a new trainer, it's never gonna look good the first time you train with a new trainer. It takes years to really soak in everything a new trainer is gonna teach you. Same thing with Deontay Wilder, him training with Malik Scott. A lot of people want Deontay Wilder to come in and fight the biggest, baddest names right away, and I'm like, dude, let this guy fight 1 or 2 months first, and let him work in some things that Malik Scott was teaching him. So he's fighting a guy that's not a threat, so he can actually do it live in action. Because some things can't be done on an elite level when you're just learning. It's too much too soon. So Deontay Wilder, if he wants to come back in the ring and implement everything he learned from Malik Scott, he needs to do it against bums. Guys aren't threats. Fighting a Andy Ruiz or like Joy Joyce or Danny Dubois, those guys are too elite. That's too soon. He needs to fight like a nobody. He needs to fight some easy touches. Tyson Fury, those trilogies, those were tough fights. Tough fights, and he was just stopped. So he needs to get his feet wet. He needs to get his confidence back, and he needs to get his confidence back and get wins doing things he's not used to doing. He needs to get a knockout without knocking guys out with a right hand. But maybe if he gets a win by body shot, that'd be a big deal. Just different things. I like what I seen with Chris Eubank Jr. and I like that he implemented the game plan with Roy Jones Jr. I would like to see him finish a fight next time doing a Roy Jones Jr. type style instead of doing his style. I didn't like that he reverted back to what he used to do. That's what I seen with this Chris Eubank Jr. thing. He reverted back to it because his Roy Jones Jr. type style didn't work. It worked for a little bit. He landed a few punches that were Roy Jones Jr. type style, but ultimately he got the job done doing what he does best. But stick to the style that guy's trying to teach you, man, because it's not going to mean anything if you try. It's like learning a new punch and throwing it twice and then doing what you do, back to what you used to do. If you're going to be training Roy Jones Jr., use his style all the time. He's a legend, all time great. You know what time it is. Y'all must have forgot. Anyway, let me know how you guys feel about it, though. Like, comment, subscribe. It's the Empire. Geoboxing Empire. Peace.